Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Pentecost with APA Virginia staff. Thank you for joining us for our monthly webinar series, Your Hour with APA Virginia, sponsored by the Berkeley Group. I see a couple of our sponsors have joined us today. Thank you, Denise and Shana from the Berkeley Group, for joining us. I see Cypress Creek Renewables. They're one of our new annual sponsors this year. Hello, Parker. Let's see. I also see we have some Department of Conservation and Recreation people with us today. Thank you for joining us. Make sure to check out all those exhibit tables at our annual conference. And speaking of that, I have a few announcements from the chapter. The 2018 annual conference, Mountains of Influence, is only 27 days away, happening July 22nd through the 25th at Wintergreen Resort. Early bird rates continue through this Sunday, June 30th, so make sure to get registered by then and save your department some money. Unless, of course, you are waiting for the most exciting time of the year, the new fiscal year. Rates increase 10% on Sunday, July 1st, so make sure to get registered right away because our mobile tours are filling up. You don't want to miss those. Students can also register at a really low rate of $50 right now. So we want you to take advantage of that by June 30th. We also have free overnight accommodations on Monday of the conference for students, but you have to let us know by June 30th. We can't guarantee it after then. So if you know of any students, undergrad or grad at BCU, Tech, or UVA, and they're a planning student, we'd love to have them this year at the conference. A schedule is available at apavirginia.com, which has information on all the sessions, mobile tours, and receptions. This is the largest statewide gathering of planners in Virginia and the best opportunity for networking and earning your CM credits. So we're excited to recognize our new FAICPs at Wintergreen this year. We've got some exciting things planned, like keynote sessions from Chuck Dupree and Kathy Galvin, a reception at Devil's Backbone, a screening of the film Tidewater, and we're bringing back our exciting conference app, which will launch soon. And I want to give a shout out to all of our annual and conference sponsors who help make it possible. APA Virginia is proud to partner with the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development's Virginia Main Street program. Be sure to check out their upcoming event, Downtown Intersections, on July 16th through the 18th in Harrisonburg. That's right before our conference. So this 3-day event offers CM credits and programs geared towards strengthening your downtown revitalization efforts and helping you create the ideal downtown destination marketplace. And look for Virginia Main Street and DHCD's exhibit booth at our conference as well. And for those who just signed on, thank you for joining us for our monthly webinar series, Your Hour with APA, sponsored by the Berkeley Group. Thank you to those who share this with your colleagues and help spread the word about our series. Our webinars are the fourth Monday of each month from noon to 1 p.m., covering many topics in the planning field. And we always offer 1 CM credit that is available for watching this live. So if you're watching a recording, you cannot get a CM credit. This info will be on apavirginia.com/webinars, and check out our YouTube page for all the recordings of our webinars. Mark your calendars for next month's webinar on July 30th. We'll have a repeat of the Legislative Update plenary session from the annual conference for those who miss it. This session will be led by Brandy Schaefer, VP of Legislative and Policy Affairs, and Eldon James, who is the chapter lobbyist and works with Eldon James and Associates. This will be the 5th Monday in July due to the annual conference, so we hope you all are at the annual conference on July 22nd. Visit apavirginia.com/webinars to sign up. Today we have Olivia H. Devereaux of Devereaux Environmental Consulting presenting on the Chesapeake Assessment Scenario Tool, or CAST. Olivia is an environmental scientist with an expertise in BMP planning and implementation and nutrient trading. She has performed water quality assessments and is a scientific lead in developing CAST 2017 and has played a key role in many other environmental modeling initiatives. We will take questions throughout the webinar, so go ahead and type them in the questions box as we go along. And Olivia, I will now hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. I appreciate that. I appreciate the American Planning Association inviting me to talk about CAST to y'all. So thank you. Let me get started here and tell you just a little bit about CAST and where it came from and how it's used. It was originally developed in 2011 by Jessica Riggleman and myself, and then the Bay program, and people were using it at that time for the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, and because that had just come out and the states were asked to develop watershed implementation plans. What happened now in 2016, 2017, is the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnerships model was adapted so that it essentially works like CAST, and now CAST is the same as the Chesapeake Bay watershed model. So it is calibrated to monitoring data and to the latest science. And when you're running this model, you're running the same model that is used for the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. It has a lot of capacity in it. It is designed for a lot of different types of users, and all of them have one thing in common, which is that they're trying to determine what the nitrogen, phosphorus, or sediment load is from various management actions. So what we do is we allow you to work at a multitude of geographic scales and look at the effect of different BMPs, or best management practices. And we provide all the background data, so if you wanted to dig into how all the calculations are done, you can do that, but it's really designed so that you don't have to do that if you don't want to, and it should be fairly easy to use and to view your results. The users are people like yourselves who use it for planning at a smaller scale. You can plan at a county scale, or for a planning district commission, or for a river basin, or for the entire state. So it's got a lot of flexibility there. We also have some land uses in there that are go from 1985 through 2025. So we've got those projections, and you could use those to look at the impact of land use development over time. And you can also use it to look at the effect of different BMPs. What are the effect of BMPs geographically? If I do a forest buffer in Richmond City, what is the effect there? If I do it somewhere else, what is the effect somewhere else? It's not necessarily the same, as we all know. So you can look at the geographic location where those BMPs will reduce the most load. And then you can also say, well, what if I do a stormwater performance standard treating 1 inch versus 1.2 inches? What's going to be the difference in the nutrients that run off? So you can look at those sorts of questions using CAST. So first off, this is the CAST homepage, and I just want to kind of walk you through a little bit of how to use CAST and show you how to answer some of these different questions.
Olivia, before we keep going, we are seeing, I think, your desktop screen and not the CAST website.
Oh, let me see.
All right.
How's that?
Okay. That looks good. Okay.
The CAST screen?
Yes.
Okay.
We're good to go.
All right. Okay. So this is the CAST homepage, and there's a lot of information on this page, and I'm just going to scroll down so you can see we've got some documentation. You can look at the monitoring data. We've got source data, which you'll want to use as a reference. Some GIS layers if you want to work off of some GIS layers. But what I want to show you first is how we've got kind of a how-to for developing a plan. And so I want to just walk through this and some of the resources available on this page. The first step, as we envision it, is to start off by establishing your programmatic goals. So if you're in a jurisdiction that has let's say, an MS4 permit, and you've already got funding sources, you already have various programs in place, and maybe you're looking at developing or changing a program that has some rules around large lot development, for example. And if you're looking at doing new development of large lots, then perhaps you want to preserve some forest cover in those areas. So that would result in creating, some tree canopy, some forest buffers. You might have those as translate into the BMPs. You may also have other goals associated with that program, which could be something like fish habitat, you want a lot of brook trout. Those are going to be your co-benefits. And then more than likely, you're going to have some goals for what you need to hit for your nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment reduction. And of course, everyone has limited budgets, so that's an issue. So you're looking at these issues about what is my target load, what are the co-benefits I need to hit, I want to target, and then what are the costs? And that gets translated to the BMPs. So then you're looking at the BMPs that would make the best impact on achieving your goal of keeping forest cover with large lot development. And is it forest buffers? Is it tree planting? Is there something else that you should do? Translate that to BMPs, put those into a scenario and see if you're getting the goals that you wanted. And if you're not, then perhaps you need to do more of those BMPs or look at some additional BMPs. So it's kind of a process of trying out some things, seeing if you're getting the effect you want, and then iteratively going through and until you hit your objectives. And that's kind of talked about through this page. And so we have in here some additional resources separate from building scenarios, and I will show you how to build scenarios, but we do also have some other information like just the pounds reduced per BMP. So we have a list of all the BMPs, and in there we say what is the pounds of nitrogen, phosphorus, or sediment reduced per BMP. Now this is an estimate, it's a generalization. It's a little bit more complicated than saying every BMP always has the same effect, but we give you an average for a county, and you can look at that. So it's got the pound reduced per BMP, and it also tells you the cost effectiveness of that BMP. So you can say, well, both these two BMPs reduce the load by a certain amount, but this other one is less expensive. So that's in a spreadsheet that you can download. And if, for example, your co-benefits were brook trout, then you can take a look at this brook trout fact sheet and see what are the issues associated with that. And it even has helpful contact information. I'll just open this real quick so you can see. There's a list of BMPs, and then when I scroll to the bottom, it has the Virginia contact of Steve Reeser. So it's got quite a bit of detail, and these are very well thought through fact sheets on these co-benefits. So you can take a look at those. And then there's some other information on this page, but I just wanted you to see this and know that this is a resource that's available to you in a way to kind of think about the structure, the whole process for doing a plan. And that was under develop a plan. There's a lot of information under reports before you even log in, but let's log in so we can create our own scenarios. So I've already created a login and I'm logging in, and it brings me to the scenarios page. This is where your landing spot is when you're doing different actions in CAST. On the scenarios page, we have my scenarios, and I created one here, and then we have shared scenarios. And these are all the official shared scenarios. They're shared with everyone. There are also scenarios that people can create and share with you. So you may have scenarios that are shared just with you, and they would be in this list as well. We have here a list, and I'm going to just click here to sort it in reverse order. And we end up with a progress scenario for every year from 2017 back through 1985. Those are the BMPs that were active and working on the ground in any of those years. And that's for every geography in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So all of Virginia that is in the Bay watershed is covered there. And those are the BMPs that DEQ and DCR have reported to the Chesapeake Bay program as being implemented and functional. You may have a separate list that for your municipality, and it may be different, but this is what the Bay program considers as the official BMPs that are functioning. So there are versions next to these last 4 years, the 2014 through 2017. Those should be finalized hopefully in the next month. And when they are finalized, they will just be listed similar to this 2013 progress without a version number. And then the WIP that was done by Virginia for the last part of the Bay TMDL, the phase 2 WIP, is in here. It was adjusted from the old version of the model to this new version. So it's not exactly what they submitted because we had to translate it to this new version of the model, but it's here and it provides a nice point of comparison for what could be a plan for 2025. Now, if any of y'all are working on developing the Phase 3 watershed implementation plan, I know that Virginia will be sharing a draft version for the WIP 3. So those are the official scenarios. Those provide a nice point of comparison. Let me show you how we can do a comparison if we were to look at, you know, what is the difference in loads. We have maps in here. And you can pick different things in this map. And I went to results maps to get here. And then it's on this page, but I like to see it full page. So I click on that first. And we have a 2013 that pops up. Let's go and compare the two most recent years. Let's compare 2017, and then over here, I'll pick 2016. And we're looking at the nitrogen edge of stream load. Now this is the entire Chesapeake Bay. I don't want to see that. I really just want to see, let's say, Richmond, Virginia. So we'll zoom in on Richmond. And I can see here that in this key that, you know, we've got greater than 300,000 pounds of nitrogen, and that looks like it's the same for Richmond. When I click on it, then up pops a box, and if I scroll down, I can see the nitrogen edge of stream, and EOS's edge of stream is 590 in 2017, and over here, we've got it as 458. So we've got some differences here, and that's curious to me because it shows the load going up. That's probably why these scenarios aren't final yet, is because they're not showing the latest and greatest information. And we can scroll down and see this broken out by sector, so we can look at the developed sector, which of course in this area is going to be the majority of the load. Natural is another sector that would include your forest, it would include your load from streams, you know, from erosion from banks. It would include your wetland areas. And then we have the septics and wastewater of course will be significant. So those are the information that's available on maps, and it's useful to compare and see it on a map, and I like to be able to do that. Most people think in 3 dimensions. We certainly live in 3 dimensions, so seeing it on a map gives a little more perspective. So I'll close out of that, and we'll go back and look at our scenarios. I want to jump right into this and show you how to add a new scenario so we can edit some BMPs. So I click on Add New Scenario, and I'm going to say we're creating a plan for, I'm just going to say 2019 Virginia plan. Put in my description. And what's nice about this is you can come back to this page and make edits along the way. And then there are 2 categories of BMPs available, and if you hover over a question mark, it pops up and tells you what that is. I'm going to pick planning BMPs. That's what everyone here I think will mostly want. And then we can use these different geographies. Let me take a minute to kind of walk through these because there's a whole slew of options. So for most of these, we have the area that's in the CBWS, Chesapeake Bay watershed only. So there are a lot of counties, Accomack is an example, that's partially in and partially out of the watershed. If you were only interested in the part that's in the watershed, you would pick area in CBWS only. If you want the entire county, then you would just pick county. We also have the Hydrologic Unit Code, or HUC. That's a USGS designation of a watershed area, and that's at different scales. 4 is going to be the largest, and then 12 will be the smallest. When using CAST, HUC 12s are the smallest geography in CAST. We also have modeling segments, which is great for modelers, not so useful for anybody else. We have major basin, so that would be like the entirety of the James. And then we have state basins. So for example, the Potomac River Basin is in 5 different states, but if you wanted the Potomac that's just in Virginia, you could do that. We've got the state, and then the state area in Chesapeake Bay watershed only. And then what's really useful for Virginia is we've got planning district commissions, soil conservation districts, and then soil conservation district areas, of which there are 5 total. So I'm just going to pick Planning District Commission. And I'll go ahead and type in Richmond into my search box and move that one over. But all of them were listed before I had limited my search to Richmond. And then we're going to pick our base year. We already said this was a plan for 2019. I'm picking 2019. There are 2 different base conditions. In Virginia, they're pretty close. For any plan associated with the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, it's expected that you use the current zoning. Other planners purposes may want to use historic trends. In many areas, current zoning can be a little environmentally optimistic with more infill, that sort of thing. So you might want to take a look at those in more detail. Then we have a wastewater data set. This isn't something you can edit, but it is something you have to select. So we have them for years that have actually happened, like 2017, and then we have 3 for the future. So WIP2 would be the one that's projected for 2025. No action is really your 1985 condition. E3 is a funny acronym. It stands for everything, everywhere, by everyone. So it's the assumption that if everybody did all the BMPs that are currently available to the maximum extent practicable, that's what they would do. So that's a pretty high level of wastewater controls. I'm just going to pick 2017. And then we have costs in here. Now we have default costs for all the states and an average for the watershed. You may want to create your own cost profile. I frequently do this, and I'll show you how to do that later. But for now, I'm just picking Virginia. I can come back later and change the cost profile once I create one. We'll do that up here under cost profiles. And then I can share this scenario, so I can pick users to share it with. So I'll see if, I can share this scenario with a number of people. I'll share it with somebody at DEQ. And I can just put in here notes. And it's good to keep track of your changes. Sometimes people say that, oh, I had a scenario and this is what it was for, and I added a bunch of BMPs, but I can't remember where I was going with it or which version I was working in. So you may want to add a note like, increasing stormwater controls. And then if you come back to it later, you may want to say, increase by 10% or whatever you want to do. Then there are many options for adding BMPs. If I were to go ahead and save this right now, it wouldn't have any BMPs in it. And we know that there are already BMPs on the ground, so most people are starting with a point with saying, well, we know we've got BMPs on the ground, so let's start with what's known to be there, and then we'll add to it. So I'm going to copy BMPs from an existing scenario. And you can do this for different sectors. So if I've got a colleague working with a soil conservation district, I may want to ask them to share a scenario with me, and I'll copy over what they've done, and I'll work in the developed sector, or vice versa. So you can use it that way. But for now, we'll just pick a single scenario, and I'm picking 2017. I typed 2017 into that search box, and so it limited the list. So I could just grab that latest 2017 scenario. And I'm just going to click Save. And then that is editing. And when it's finished creating that scenario, I can go in there and make some more changes. But this is how you would create a scenario. And you can also create another scenario based on that one so that you can make some additional changes and save your various versions along the way. Let's go back into it, and I'll show you something about the BMPs. So it opens up the scenario metadata, and I can take a look and change something in here if I want. There are the developed BMPs. So let's look at those first. There's a table at the top, and these arrows expand things. So I can expand and see the land uses that do not, the land uses in this area. So this is the Richmond Regional Planning District Commission, and I can see all of these urban land uses and what the acres are. Now this is just the urban area. There are going to be other acres that are in forest, they're going to be miles of streams, acres of wetlands, and so forth. But I can see, looking at this, that we've got quite a few acres as non-regulated turf grass. And this is just information that can be useful to refer to as you're building your scenario. If I scroll to the bottom of the screen, I can see the BMP data submitted. And this is what we copied in from 2017. And I can see that there are a lot of infiltration practices, there are bioretention rain gardens. When I hover over the BMP name, the definition pops up. And I'm just scrolling through here. I saw some permeable pavement with sand vegetation on seedy soils with an underdrain. It's a little funny to me because some of these BMPs are very specific, like this one, and then others are a little more general. And the definitions were developed by expert panels, and so you end up with people who like to split out all the differences, and then some people like to group them together, but they were all put together by expert panels reviewing the research and how things work in the real world to come up with efficiencies or effectiveness values for each of these BMPs. So we've got quite a few in here. One thing we could do is we could go in here and say, well, we've got this bioretention rain garden here. We may want to edit that. We can see that this looks like an individual project. It's in here again with a different amount. That's probably a different project. So we could do this planning and say we're going to make it a little bit bigger. But when you're doing plans, and again, I should back up and say we copied this data in from 2017. So it's likely that these should be already implemented, and these are probably submitted as individual projects. But if we're doing a plan, we're doing a large-scale plan here. We're not looking at, we're going to do 15 individual projects, and each of them are different, and the engineers have already developed the details associated with it. What we're doing is we're saying we're going to do some broader scale what-if question. So what if we did some stormwater performance standard that had a requirement of treating a certain number of acres, of which a certain amount would be impervious? Or what if we did a requirement of 0.1% forest buffers? What would that look like in terms of the effect on the loads? So you can go in here and you can edit this, and that's certainly an option to do that. But you can also go in here, and I X'd out of it, you can also go in here and do Add BMP. So I'm going to click on that. And when I do that, I have these options of a geographic scale. So I'd already picked the whole Planning District Commission, but right now I want to just go and select the county. So I'm going to pick Richmond City, but all of those are the cities or counties that all of those fall within the Planning District Commission we established as our scenario. We have agencies in here, and these help our federal friends. So if I were with GSA, I would just be picking GSA or Department of Defense, but we're going to stick with non-federal. And then we can select our BMP. Now, there is a host of BMPs in here, and it can be confusing to figure out which one to pick. So I'm going to show you a little bit later on in this webinar some resources for determining which are the most effective. And I mentioned that a little bit early on when we were looking at that on the home page under Develop a Plan. But for now, let's go and just pick our buffer. And if I pick buffer, then you can see there's a secondary BMP that pops up as forest buffer. When I click on that, I can see that there's also the option of doing a grass buffer. But I'm going to stick with a forest buffer because it's effective, and a grass buffer is not particularly effective, according to the expert panel who worked on this. And the reason they gave for that was that while they could be effective if they're never mowed, typically people don't like that, and they end up getting mowed, and then they're not effective. So that's why we stick with forest buffers. And we can put this on various load sources or land uses. I'm going to go with the most general one here. This is turf grass in developed, and it says off to the right, it includes MS4, CSS for combined sewer systems, and non-regulated areas. Now I could put it on any one of these individual ones if I wanted to be very targeted, But again, if you're looking at a plan in the future, you're probably not getting into that level of detail. If you're doing something that's on a fairly small area, then you would know if it was MS4 or non-regulated or whatever. And then I can put this in as a percent or acres and buffers. Depending on the BMP, these units change. And I'll just say that we're going to do, 20 acres here as an example. And I click Save, and it makes sure that everything I entered is valid, and it pops up. These two pop up first, and then the rest of the row populates, and you can see that it's in there fully. Now, if I look at that and I go, oops, I meant to enter 23, I can click on Edit and change that to 23. So now we've got our 2017 scenario with the addition of this one BMP. And I'm not saying this is one project with 23 acres. I'm really saying that across the entire county, we're going to have 23 acres, and that could be 10 different projects. So let me pause here now that I've shown you how to create a scenario and add some BMPs and see if you'll have questions. And then after the questions, we'll look at what the effect of that BMP is. So I think y'all can ask questions, over the phone or over your computer microphone, and that would be a good way to do it. Or you could also have entered it in the question box.
Yes, we'll give them a second. I don't have any questions that have come through just yet. We'll see. And we'll also do questions at the end as well.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to pause and make sure everybody was following along.
Okay.
So we've added that BMP. I'm going to add one more BMP before we go to look at our results. And I think, the results are what everybody wants to see. So let's just do another one. And I'm going to pick county, and I'll do the same thing. I'll pick Richmond City, and I'll pick non-federal. And this time I'm going to pick a stormwater performance standard. Oops, I clicked my mouse in the wrong place. I'm going to pick the stormwater performance standard. And we have runoff reduction and stormwater treatment. So y'all can read what those definitions are, but stormwater treatment is more effective than simply reducing the runoff from a site. And here you'll see that this list of load sources is much longer than what it was when we picked forest buffer. So we have a lot more options. I could put it on tree canopy in developed areas. That would be, trees next to a road, or what I call street trees, where they're planted in little boxes along the sidewalk in the downtown area. I can put it on a category called developed, MS4 developed. So that would include roads, buildings, turf grass, tree canopy. That includes a lot of different individual sources. And I can separate out non-regulated from MS4, from CSS. So part of Richmond is CSS or CSO, and part of it is not. But because I don't know this is just a general plan, I'm going to, in my hypothetical here, I'm just going to pick developed, and that includes pretty much everything. And then we've got the choice of units, and this one, there's not really a choice. There's only the one. So we'll go with that. We'll put the amount down. Let's say that throughout the entire county, we're going to treat 150 acres total, and of that, 75 are impervious. And I'm obviously just making this up. And we'll treat 1 acre foot. And I'll click Save. If I wasn't sure how to convert inches treated to acre foot, then that's okay. You can go up to the top of the page, and and on most pages, there's a link for view documentation. And if you click on that, it opens another window, and it jumps to the page we're on. So we're on Develop BMPs, and it jumps there, and it'll have a Q&A. Almost all of these have a Q&A, and it tells you how to do different things. So what is CSS if you weren't sure? And what is the benefit between putting on MS4 versus regulated versus non-regulated? So there are a lot of questions here, and then if you're working with the more technical people, then they will want to know what is the actual equation that is used. So I've written that out for people. And then we've got stormwater performance standards and how to calculate that. So we've got that in here too. So I'll close that, but I wanted you to know that this documentation is a good resource. So now we've added these 2 BMPs, buffers. We've got force buffers and the stormwater performance standard. And so I think what we're ready to do now is to run it. We've added it, we're ready to go. And so I'll go back to the scenarios page. And this is the one we're working on. It says last edits complete. I can go back and continue editing, or I can click run. I'm just going to click run, have that scenario done. And while it's running, we'll go to results and we'll get our results. Now you can't actually get your results till it's done running, but my experience is that most of these run so quickly that by the time I get there, it's pretty much done. So I showed you the map earlier when we were comparing scenarios. The maps only work for the official scenarios. We don't have maps for individual scenarios because it's a huge amount of data. And that may be something we're able to do in the future, but for right now we've got some data space limitations. But we can look at graphs for any scenario. So I want to go through here, and even though my scenarios for all of the Richmond Regional PDC, we only put those BMPs on Richmond City. So I'm going to pick Richmond City for my comparison. And I could do all agencies, but I'm going to stick with non-federal. And then I think it might be useful to look at a couple of different things here. So we did this scenario for 2019, but let's just look at well, let's just do a two-way comparison. We'll compare 2017 to the 2019 one. Let's see, I lost my place. The 2019, and then just for fun, we'll compare it to what was in the WIP 2 if that were on a 2025 land use. So what we're doing here, and I'll click graph, but what we're doing is we're actually comparing 2 things. We're comparing a change in the land use, so presumably we'd have more developed land, and we're also comparing a change in the BMPs. So we've got 2 things going on now. If you wanted to, you could isolate what the effects are just from a change in the land use or just from a change in the BMPs. And I can talk about how to do that later if you're interested. So this up here is a key, and I can click all of these and end up with a lot on this graph, but phosphorus is such a lower loading, I usually take that off. And then for local planning, what is delivered to the edge of the tide, or EOT is edge of tide, that's the edge of the tidal area of the bay. And that's usually less interesting to most people when you're working at a local level. So I'm now just looking at my nitrogen edge of stream. So this is what is predicted to be the load for 2017 with the BMPs on the ground in 2017, and that's 773,000 pounds. And then when I look at our plan, our hypothetical plan for 2019, we've got 771. So we've brought the load down by some, and we can see the difference there. Now, 2025 WIP had a much higher load for that nitrogen edge of stream, so we're actually doing better in Richmond. That's not true throughout the watershed. So we can also unclick that and look at phosphorus edge of stream, and this scale does change as you do this. Now our phosphorus load has gone down with those 2 BMPs that we added, but not significantly. And then that's the WIP too. And then here's sediment over here. This is in pounds. Sometimes people expect to see it in tons, but I just want to point out it's also in pounds. And we can see that that load has shifted as well. The force buffers are usually pretty good at trapping sediment, as well as the nitrogen and phosphorus. So those are our loads for our 2 scenarios. And I kind of find it handy if sometimes I get called into a meeting and have to rush and get something ready really quick. You can just print directly from CAST and stick these in a PowerPoint. And then here are our sources. So one of the big questions that tends to get asked is, well, how much is mine? How much is in my sector? So you can look here and see how much is in yellow, which is natural. That's your forest load and your stream load. How much is in green, which is developed, and then how much is wastewater. So we're in Richmond City, and most of it is wastewater. That shouldn't be a surprise. And that's true in both of these scenarios, but you can see that. I don't see any agriculture in here. Again, no surprise. And then we can scroll down and we can see what it is for phosphorus. And for phosphorus, we have a bit more in developed. And again, for sediment, where you see a lot more load coming from natural for sediment. And it's pretty much the same across while the total amount changes across the three scenarios, you can see that the proportion is about the same among the three. We are also going to be adding in the load in terms of pounds per acre. So we're going to talk about this a little bit. We show the load in terms of total pounds, but if you're using something very local and you're looking at your own land use, it's not going to match the Chesapeake Bay program's land use categories, which are roads, buildings. You know, it's got the turf, it's got the tree canopy over turf grass, and it's got all, let's see, total of about 50 different load sources that are listed. So you may not have those same ones in the data that you have, and you may not want to use those same categories. So what you can do is simply take the categories you do have. Maybe you have just two, pervious and impervious. And you can say, well, what is the loading rate for buildings that's comparable to, you know, your own impervious, and just use that loading rate. And by loading rate, I mean pounds per acre, and you can just multiply that out. And if you want to do the same for impervious, you may decide that turf grass is comparable to the majority of your, I'm sorry, pervious is what I meant to say, and you could just use that loading rate. So sometime in about a month, we're going to add another tab with loading rate. You can also calculate the pounds per acre yourself in the meantime. So let me show you another set of data that you can get out of CAST. I showed you the maps. I showed you the graphs. Comparing scenarios is the same data, but it's in it's in a table, and it does have acres in it. But I want to show you the reports. So we can select a list of the BMPs, and there are three different BMP reports. BMP summary report is the most summarized. BMP input files is the most detailed, and it is probably more detailed than what most people want, but I use that sometimes. And then submitted and credited is the kind of the intermediate one. But let's get the most summarized first. And for this BMP report, we will go and pick our 2019 Virginia plan. Oops, I skipped a box here, so it tells me I skipped my geographic scale. And I'm going to pick Richmond again and move that over using this arrow over here. And go back and pick that 2019 plan. And then I can download that report. My old reports are here as well. Sometimes I forget what I did in these other reports. You can always click on this metadata tab. It's not metadata in the sense that you might think of it if you were doing GIS, but it is the selections you made. So if you want to go back and check on that to remind yourself, you can do so. So this is a little small. Let me make this bigger. We have here a README tab and a bunch of other tabs, and I'll just walk through this. We've got the data source version. The Bay program occasionally makes updates. The idea was they would only make updates every 2 years. So in 2017, we're using a 2017 model, and then they would make them again in 2019, and then the model version would be 2019. There have been some decisions that have been made to update the data. So we went to A, B, and C. So we're now on 2017 C. I find that unfortunate because it is hard when you're doing projects, but that's the way it is. This is today's date, the day we created this file. If I created one last week, then it would have last week's date. This reminds me what my selections were. It's always good to just, verify that you clicked on the things you intended to click on. And then we can look at our summary BMPs. And when I do Excel, I always expand these columns to their full size. So this is agricultural practices. That's of no use when we're looking in Richmond. So I'm scrolling past all the ag practices, and I'm looking at this urban-suburban practices. And we can see this performance standard that we entered here, and this is the one that we just put in, and we put it on 150 acres, and that comprises 0.5% of the land. The other BMPs that we copied in fall into these categories, and you can see that a lot of it was extended dry ponds. That should be no surprise. Wet ponds, wetlands, that's no surprise. I was talking to a developer yesterday, and he was telling me he just did a project with another dry pond. So, we're still seeing some of those same ones implemented fairly commonly. And then this is a composite. If you figure out, what the sum of all of these are for the total available acres, we get stormwater treatment on about 5% of the land. And then erosion and sediment control is something that would go on construction land. And we've got some other information in here for the other BMPs. So this gives you a nice little summary. And we've got the resource practices. Resource practices tend to go on the natural sector. So the only one here is forest harvesting practices, and there must be a little bit of something classified as the harvested forest in Richmond, which is probably not true, but that's why that would show up. And then I skipped over showing you land policy, but I will come back to that because you're probably curious what that one is. And then if you wanted to know how this report is created and what's summarized, we've got, an information over here that tells you how these BMPs were summarized. So if I were to just filter this and say, we saw the category of, I'll pick dry ponds, what fell into that? And that one just had dry ponds. But if we were to pick instead erosion and sediment control, that actually includes different levels. So we've got 3 different levels of that in that one category on this page. So it's all summarized. And this is why we call it the BMP summary report. And I think it's a handy report, but people do tend to get confused and say, wait a minute, I entered something else. Why is it not listed here the same way? And it's because it is a summary. So we'll close out of that and go back to CAST. And that was the BMP report. The other one I wanted to show you today is a loads report. And selecting Richmond again. And our same scenario. Well, it's not on my list, but I'll show you the 2017 progress. And then there are definitions for these aggregations. I'm just going to pick source fed versus non-fed and major source as options to show you how that looks. And I actually did one of these earlier, so I'm just going to download this because I see we're getting a little short on time. And you can see here that we've got these categories here. And this unit refers to the amount. So we can see that most of the acres here are in regulated developed. And then we can see the nitrogen load edge of stream for these scenarios. So then we've got and this is phosphorus load P, and that's all defined under the README. So you can see where your loads are greatest. And this is where, if you wanted to calculate your pounds per acre, you would do that by simply dividing the pounds by the acres. And you've got this here. This report has 3 different aggregations. This is major source, and this one is minor source. So we've got these developed, broken out into construction, pervious and impervious, and then we've got it in all the detail, which is probably too much detail for most people. These ag ones, we've got grains with manure, first full season soybeans, so it's more or less by crop. And then you can get down into the developed ones and see that it's broken out into quite a bit of detail. And we have it for all of the federal agencies. So that's your loads report, and sometimes it's more convenient to work in a spreadsheet, and sometimes you really just want to see a table on the screen where you would use compare scenarios, and if you want those graphs, you would use those. Let me pause here and see if there are any questions that I can respond to, and if not, I'll just give you a few tips for places where you can go for additional information.
I do have one question that came in from Dana Jackson asking the cost shown on the example for the unit acre for reforestation showed $35. Is that accurate?
Well, I don't know that I can say any of these costs are accurate. Maybe the best thing to say is that none of them are accurate. The thing to do is to edit the costs. So I would go to the cost profile and just copy the costs from Virginia. I don't need to save it. If I want to share it later, I can. And then I just created my cost profile, and I would go in here and edit this. So clicking on this, we were looking at buffers, and I'll just filter here to buffers. And the lifespan is 75 years, a capital cost of $683, and these are very precise. I realize that. It's a little ridiculous that they're this precise, but these are the data that were calculated by contractors to EPA. It was done by both RTI and APT Associates at different time periods. No operation and maintenance for a forest buffer in the developed sector, and there's no opportunity cost. Sometimes people forget their economics or haven't had economics, but opportunity cost represents the lost revenue from other sources. So typically that's like a land rental cost. If I didn't have a buffer there, I could build an apartment building, for example. But we don't classify it as a buffer, as a developable area, so there's zero opportunity cost. And then $35 is annualized. And this is per acre. So this unit of buffers are put in terms of acres. So it's $35 a year for that. And if you want to know how that's calculated, you would go to view documentation, and the formula is in here. So when we say it's annualized, it's broken out over the 75 years, and we've got the formula. So I won't go over that, but it's how much it would cost for 75 years. Since these BMPs are in different lifespans, we do want to make them all comparable. So we put them in terms of just 1 year, and that is the annualized cost, which is why a forest buffer looks so low, even though you have this initial year commitment for implementing it. You could go in here if you wanted and change all of these to 1. And again, I've got it filtered to just buffers. But if you change them to 1 and click Save, then you get an annualized cost that is really all of those in the same year. And that may be more what you're looking for. If you're looking at something on a county council term, and your term is 4 years, then you might want to put 4 years in there and see what the 4-year commitment is, if that's the budget year that you're working with. So there are different ways of doing it. But anyway, that's one way to change this and to use these data. And much more detail about that and how to use them is in the documentation. And again, I changed the year, but you can go in here and change any of these numbers. So when I click, the box changes color, and I can type in a different number. And then the annualized cost is not something you can change. It is calculated for you.
Thanks.
So if you're using okay, are there any others, Sarah?
No, there aren't. I was going to say that there are not any. If you wanted to go ahead and give some tips or pointers.
Mm-hmm. So just a couple of things about where to get more information. If you're using CAST, and again, I mentioned this at the beginning, but I'm going to repeat it. There's some more information under Develop a Plan. There's some spreadsheets that have some really useful data for how to prioritize BMPs and figure out what the cost per BMP is and the pound reduced per BMP by downloading this spreadsheet. If I just click on it, it downloads the spreadsheet. Going back to the home page, there's source data, and if I click on View Source Data, I can download a narrative document which is interesting if you want to dig into the details. But this source data is also a good resource because it gives you all in one place the definitions for all the load sources and all the BMPs and a ton more information. So for every tab in this Excel spreadsheet, there's a bullet point telling you what's going to be in there. So you can take a look at that. And then there's some detailed information for agriculture, which I rarely get questions or people asking for this, but if you want it, I wanted you to just know that it's there if you scroll down. And then if you want to compare this to the monitoring data, and I frequently do this, people always say, well, this is a model, what does it really mean? You know, and that's great and all, but you know, what does it look like in terms of actual water quality monitoring? Then I do go to look at the monitoring data. So I was looking at river trends. What I meant to do is look at this USGS non-tidal monitoring stations. And if you click on them, you can see this map. There, you know, if you're working in a small area, there may not be a lot of monitoring, but you may have you may get lucky and have a station near you. So you can zoom in and see where there's a station that's of interest. So you can go and take a look and see what's going here on the Mattapanai, for example, and get all that information. The other place is under How To. We have webinars that have been previously recorded, and some of those may be useful, and you may want to go back to them. So we have kind of an introduction, just how to edit BMPs, some of the information we already went over, and then targeting reductions is useful. And then I did a webinar with the Center for Stormwater Network for local government planners, and I have a how-to guide in there that walks you through. In fact, I think I have it open. I do. I have a how-to guide that walks you through how to answer several questions. And David Wood developed this with me, and he was really helpful coming up with all these questions and helping to organize this so it's clear. So some of this may be useful. This was not just for Virginia. It was for anywhere in the watershed. So there's a question in here that's particularly for Maryland, but skip that one. This is a little bit of a how-to guide, and there's an accompanying spreadsheet you may find helpful. So we have these other webinars. I'll put this webinar up here when it's ready from Sarah. We also have tutorial videos about where do I start, how do things work. Some of those may be helpful. And then the user documentation, which I've shown you a number of times, and you can click that documentation on the page, or you can go in here and just work your way through it. Hopefully CAST is more self-explanatory. The one thing I want to point out is if you're getting results that don't quite make sense to you, or you think, hey, it's broken, this doesn't work right, go to results, understanding results, and it'll answer some pretty detailed questions. So once you get into it, just remember you might want to come back to that. And then lastly, there's Contact Us. So if you have a question, feel free to use Contact Us, and it will more than likely be me answering the question, and I'll answer any question from, you did that webinar and I saw you showed some kind of map, how did you get to it? Or I did this scenario and I got these results and it's not looking right, I don't understand it. Or I'm working on a project where I want to talk about what loads were reduced from the projects we've implemented. What are your tips for the best place to start? How should I approach this problem? So any and every question is welcome, and I'm happy to answer those. And then lastly, we do have the About CAST, which is just general information, and we also have upgrade history. So whenever we make changes, we put that in here. And so sometimes, like here, we did people were having trouble logging in, so we did a whole new system for logging in to simplify it. And then when the Bay program decides to make changes, which they should no longer be doing, but they seem to still make a few edits, then we put those in here, what those changes were, so that you'll know what those were. And that was about upgrade history. That's really all I have. I'm happy to answer any other questions now, or feel free to email me later or use Contact Us.
Alrighty, I have not seen any other questions come in, but if you have them, go ahead and send them.
And be on the lookout for that follow-up email that will come to everyone who attended today. It will have information to log your CM credit and to sign up for next month's webinar, the legislative update, and the email will also have Olivia's contact info if you'd like to reach out to her directly. And don't see anything else coming in. So if you think of anything, email Olivia. Olivia, thank you so much for being with us today. I think that will be very useful for people who attended. And thanks everyone for sharing your lunch hour with APA Virginia. And have a great rest of your Monday.
Thank you, Sarah.